Hello. There we go, a bit of energy. Hope you've all had some coffee. You can hear me all right, I assume. Eleanor, thank you very much for the warm welcome. Before we begin, I have two questions and I have two warning notices that I have to present. So, first important question, who here is a parent? Hands up. Pretty much 2/3 of you. Okay, cool, hands down. Next question, even more important, who's interested in rap music? Hands up. Some of you, wow, that's like 25%. Yes, I heard someone go, rap music? Am I in the right conference? Yeah, I asked rap music. Okay, I will come back to both of these points presently. And before I begin, my lawyer likes me to present two warning notices, which I need you all to read. These are very, very important. Certain investors sometimes say the same sort of thing. I am usually charming. So I suppose just a little bit about me to kind of elaborate somewhat on how Eleanor introduced me and why I'm here to talk to you today. My background is in mostly technology and digital media companies. So I've built or invested in probably somewhere around about 24 companies over the last 10 years. Some of them you might have heard of, like Deliveroo, Demonware, Super Awesome, Totally Awesome, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. Myself and my co-founders built a lot of the technology that powers the multiplayer video game space today. So games like Call of Duty and World of Warcraft would have used a lot of our technology back in the day. And about 5 years ago, I started looking at the kids space to see what was going on there, because it was very, very clear that, kids emerging onto the internet as this powerhouse were going to do something very, very special and very interesting, simply because no one was really thinking about kids at all. So we started investing in that sector about 4 years ago. So I'm chairman of Totally Awesome, which is the biggest kids digital media startup in APAC. And as Eleanor mentioned, I'm CEO of Super Awesome, which is what's often referred to as the biggest privacy tech company for kids in the West. So we build a lot of the technology that's used by now hundreds of brands, kids brands and kids content owners to power all of their digital media activities. So we probably, between the two companies, we probably have more intel and more data and more insight into what is going on in the kids digital media space around the world than probably anyone else, except maybe the CIA. I have a quiz for you next. So I'm going to ask you which one of these people you think is going to control the future of digital media. You should put your hands up. So do you think this person controls the future of digital media? This is Rupert Murdoch. Hands up. Do you think he still controls it? No. Okay, wow. Does Mark Zuckerberg control the future of media? Hands up if you agree with that statement. Some of you, yes. Or is the reality that this person controls future of digital media, which is in fact what I think. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about, really it's sort of a wander through what is happening in the kids digital media space, how much disruption is going on, why it's happening, who the winners are going to be, why fundamentally you should all be thinking about kids. So first of all, let's go back to the beginning. So for years and years and years, the kids media market was really run by TV companies. So everyone, kids would watch, sort of unlimited amounts of TV content. And when we started our companies, and I went in and sort of met my first kind of chief executive in a TV media company, I said, hey, we're building a digital technology company because your kids, your consumers, they're going to be watching your content on digital devices. And there was silence. And then there was laughter as the chief executive said, like, you're crazy. Kids TV is going to be around forever. Kids watch TV on everything. They haven't stopped watching TV in decades. Why are they going to stop watching TV now? And I was escorted from the room. What's happened over the last 3, 4, 5 years, and this is data from PwC, is that kids TV across just about every country and every measure has declined and declined and declined. And over the last 4 or 5 years, depending on what channel you're looking at, the viewings have probably declined anywhere between 25 and 40%, right? And if you look at what was going on at the same time, which is sort of the trend that we saw, This is a graph showing the growth in tablet usage amongst kids. So it doesn't really take a rocket scientist to guess where kids were going and what was going to happen with TV. So this has been the two correlating patterns that have happened over the last 4 or 5 years. Not only have kids received more tablets directly, but every time Apple releases a new product, it means that there's a new second-hand, hand-me-down tablet floating around in the family home. So kids are the biggest users of second-hand tablet hardware on the planet. That's what's driving a huge amount of ownership. And in fact, if you look at, and this is some data from Super Awesome, if you look at the actual usage of internet and sort of digital time by kids across boys and girls from 4 all the way up to 18, and by the way, feel free to share this and tweet this and everything else. You know, it is now every single day for a huge proportion of their time. And for kids between the ages of 4 to 9, this is growing at 20% a year, which is absolutely huge. So this is what is going on. And you know, the challenge that all the media companies have, you know, so the Viacoms and the Turners and the Disneys and everyone else who had built amazing, fantastic business models based on fantastic, amazing content, is that kids are going somewhere else. So this is setting up 2 huge battles in the kid space. And I like a battle. It's dramatic. It's interesting. And the first battle, so it's what I call the sort of the old money versus the young money battle, right? Old money are the older media companies, the more traditional media companies making great content for TV. And their model has always been around licensing and advertising dollars specifically around TV. And the challenge is that as kids' viewing is shifting across more and more to digital, those business models are under threat because there are simply less kids' eyeballs looking at TV content. So old money is now being faced with young money, which are the new digital players coming into the space, providing ways to access this kids' audience. So for all my rap fans, can you name the 3 rappers? Nice. We're going to have a conversation later on. And this is one of the great battles that you have to understand, which is happening in the kids' media market right now. Because it is a battle that is, you know, it is not sort of that digital is better than TV or TV is better than digital. They are different ways of engaging with the same audience. But if you are an advertiser, your challenge is, how do you replicate what you are losing in TV reach with digital, which is a very, very, very different media. And the reason that this battle is getting heated and the reason that you see me so animated on a stage like this today with you all is you look at the size of the emerging prize. And this is data that was released by PwC. This is some of the very, very first data in the world on the size of the kids' digital ad market. If you're going to tweet anything, you should probably be tweeting this slide. So for years, the kids' media market was TV-driven. There's about $6 or $7 billion a year that's spent on kids' TV advertising. Today, kids' digital advertising is growing at about 25% year on year, right? It's one of the fastest growing digital ad markets on the planet. But even today, it's still only around about 15% of the total spend in the kids' media market. Now, if you think about any other sector that you guys would know, you know, digital is probably about 40 or 50% of the marketing mix. So you see just how far and just how fast this sort of red bar here is growing and growing and growing and growing. And PwC are saying that this is going to be at least $1.2 billion within the next 18 months. And it's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Trust me on this. The great thing about the kids' digital media market is because its transition to digital has been a few years behind everywhere else, we know what the future is going to look like. So it makes me look incredibly clever to be able to stand up here and tell you what this is going to look like in 3 years' time. And I'll come back to you and say, with no smugness whatsoever, I told you so. It's nice. Now, the other really interesting thing about this, the kids' media space, and why it's so strategic, is because all the media companies and all the main players are looking at what happened everywhere else. And if you look at the mainstream digital media markets, what's happened is that Facebook and Google have won, right? They have won the digital ad battle in just about every other audience. So if you look at the percentage of new digital ad growth in the adult market, right? Google and Facebook are now taking something like 98% of that. So all the media companies, all the publishers, all the content owners, right, are being shrunk into this tiny, 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 tiny little chunk here, right? And you think about the amazing IP and the amazing content that they're creating, right? You think of any sort of IP and figure and character that you grew up with when you were a kid, and it's getting shrunk into this tiny little thing here. And if I was Rupert Murdoch, I'd be getting pretty pissed right now. Yeah. If I was Mark Zuckerberg, I'd be pretty happy. This is what happened in the mainstream adult media space, right? So the reason that everyone is really starting to think about the kids market is that in boardrooms around the world, in APAC, in the US, in Europe, they're going, holy shit, this is an opportunity to change the future. It's like Back to the Future 4, right? The media version, where you can go back in time and you can change things so that Facebook and Google don't win. It's going to be an amazing movie. The challenge, of course, is that the kids space is a very, very different operating environment. And I was talking to Jean-Marc earlier, and we were talking about the challenges of working in the kids space because of all the data privacy laws. And the other really interesting thing about this space, which again is something that's kind of been underreported, is that the data privacy laws in the US and in Europe make it illegal to do any sort of tracking or behavioral targeting or any sort of personal information gathering on kids. So what's happened is that not only has the kids' digital ad market become one of the fastest growing in the world, it has become the very first and biggest privacy-based ad market on the planet. This is an ad market that functions on the basis of user anonymity, right? Which most people think is some crazy utopian liberal vision of how digital media should work, but actually it's working and it's growing. And one of the reasons it's been growing is that, you know, the FTC and soon the EU have been handing down huge fines to various companies who are breaching these laws. So as a result, you've got something that really, you know, when you talk to sort of ad tech companies about the kids space, you know, and you sort of say, well, you can't collect data and you can't track and you can't do attribution the way that you think it is, they kind of look at you as if you're crazy. But it's actually working. And this is something that any of you who are sort of adjacent to the kids space should definitely know about and be thinking about. But the other thing is, and what people are beginning to realize, especially in Europe, with the new GDPR laws rolling out, is that the kids' digital ad market is probably a preview of what the adult digital ad market is going to be in the next few years. Because everyone is seeing the backlash around data privacy and their data being collected and used for all sorts of things and sitting in Christ knows how many DMPs. The kids market is showing sort of how the alternative might be. And it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And just think about this for a second, right? Your children, so for all the parents, your children are starting to grow up in a digital world where their data privacy is actually being respected. Now, what do you think they're going to do when they sort of become 14 and 15 and they emerge into a world where everything is up for grabs? I think they're going to be pretty disruptive. This is why you need to keep an eye on this generation, these Centennials. They're going to do really interesting, explodey type stuff in a few years. But let's look at today, and let's sort of see how kids are disrupting other areas of digital media. So let's come back to TV for a second. Kids don't dislike TV content at all, right? The incredible IP that has been built by media companies and content owners everywhere is still amongst the best in the world. You look at Disney's IP and Turner's IP and Viacom's IP, like it's just incredible and kids love it. What's happening with this generation is that they don't want to watch it on that big screen in your living room, right? In fact, they don't actually care about the screen size at all. Screens are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So if you look at kids' preferences, so this was a question we asked kids in a survey. If you just had one thing to look at your favorite kind of content on, your favorite kind of TV content on, what would it be, right? And guess what? It's not the big screen in the corner. You know, it's why YouTube is becoming, obviously has become hugely popular with kids. It's why Netflix is becoming more and more popular. And here's a key thing to take away, right? The brand that kids recognize in these platforms is not a brand based on any kind of aesthetic or who's got the nicest font or who can do something like that. The brand that kids respect is how convenient is it for them to get their content, right? Kids don't really give a shit about a particular channel on TV. They really care about how quickly can I get to the content I want on YouTube or on Netflix. So you have to think about this as content programmers, as advertisers, as brands. When you're dealing with this generation, they want something that is easy and convenient. UX and kids' UX is something that you have to become a master in. And that will pay you dividends in terms of engaging with kids. Another example of this is music, right? Again, you know, you look at sort of how big iTunes still is in the adult space, how big Spotify is in the adult space. You look at kids, and the majority of kids are getting their music still from YouTube, right? They're listening to ads within their music, right? Again, not because they have a particular preference for YouTube, the brand, but it's more convenient than iTunes. You know, if you ask an 8-year-old about iTunes, 1, they probably won't even know what you're talking about. 2, they'll probably laugh at you. 3, they'll have flipped on YouTube and found their favorite track or rapper or band in the 10 seconds that it takes you to explain where iTunes actually is in your Mac OS, download the patch, run it, crash it, and then load it again, right? So kids are disrupting. So this generation, your next generation of audiophiles, of sound fans, of people who like music, are growing up listening to music in places that you, as their parents or as their brothers or sisters or uncles or aunts, are not. I'm going to come back to this point again pretty soon. One of the driving key adopters of voice in the home and voice-based AI are kids, right? Kids are talking to Alexa. Kids are talking to Siri. You know, in the space of like 5 years, we have gone from having an iPad or an Android tablet as your babysitter, to having Alexa as your babysitter. And kids are getting super comfortable with this, right? And no one, absolutely nobody knows where this is going to go. It's like, let's take some sort of early, kind of half-baked AI, which we're still kind of working on, and which isn't really used to dealing with kids, and let's put it in a room full of kids. That's basically what's happening right now. Right? So all of a sudden, kids are becoming one of the biggest proponents of AI and voice-based UX. And again, coming back to my point about convenience, you know, if kids can yell at Alexa to do a thing, and it happens like that, that's going to be very, very effective. So there's a real shift that's happening in the homes. I'm going to come back to this point because it's a really important one. The other thing that's happening is pocket money and allowance, right? Kids are actually getting more and more money over time. So this is UK data. But what's happening with the convergence and the migration across to sort of digital content is that it is a subtle tax on parents, where 5 years ago, they might have had a fairly strict allowance for their kids. But with now digital purchases and IAP, that is kind of subtly creeping up and up and up and up. And I see a few parents in the room who are kind of nodding and smiling, you know, who realize this point. Then the final one in terms of kids and their disruption is in things that are being purchased in the home, particularly technology. When a child gets to the age of about 9 or 10, they've effectively become the CTO of the household, right? They are, for any of you who have kids who are around about this age, or maybe 11 or 12, you probably know that you're out of your depth talking about some topics with them, right? Because they've grown up with this stuff. They've got more time to look at it. They've got more time to research. They are giving opinions on what they think you should be buying, right? And I was talking about this on the way in. You know, with purchases like cars, for example, you know, and a child is probably going to have an opinion on a particular car that you buy, and you might listen to it or you might humor them, whatever. But if your child tells you that they think that car is a bag of shit, you are definitely going to listen to it, and it is going to influence your purchasing decision. So not only, you know, with cars, with technology, with electronics, kids, because they're getting access to all of this information much earlier, they've got time to really become informed. They are shaping how the household is becoming, which sounds kind of scary and dystopian, right? That you might like have a little 7 or 8-year-old electronic dictator in your house. But that's kind of what's happening, right? So we should be talking about this. And this sort of brings me back to why, and again, this is a recurring theme. You know, for years, for decades, everyone in Silicon Valley essentially operated on the basis that children didn't exist on the internet, right? That was kind of the design principle. And now if you look at sort of what's going on with Amazon and what's going on with Google and what is, you know, going to come down the line, what is happening with Apple, what is going to come down the line with Facebook, is that every one of these tech companies seems to be talking about family or kids, like in the last 6 months or 12 months. Right? If you like look at the if you look at the news and the headlines, and you just do a search for kids and tech company, you will see more and more stuff happening in the last 12 months. And the reason is what I mentioned before. It's this. It's the battle for the home. It's the next frontier to control the next probably trillion-dollar marketplace, which is going to be driven by AI, automation, and fundamentally voice. Right? And the key component in this is kids. Kids are the ones who are doing an enormous amount of interacting with this. You saw Amazon, for example, roll out the first under 13 skills for Alexa about 3 or 4 or 5 weeks ago. You're going to see Google doing the same thing. When Apple eventually rolls out its device, it will be thinking about kids as well. So all of a sudden, kids have gone from being this forgotten, underserved minority population of the internet to now being the most important, the most central, the most strategic. So in whether you are on the agency side or advertiser or content, kids and under 13s and Centennials, not only are they going to be threatening how you work and what you do, but they're going to become a bigger and bigger factor in all of your brand communications over the next 4 or 5 years. I guarantee it. I will come back in 5 years' time and tell you I told you so, quite happily. So let me kind of roll into, I suppose, the last third of this, because it's, and it was funny, I actually was going to do this section about something else, and there've been a number of articles this week that came out from the New York Times and various other places, really sort of asking questions about, you know, what kind of kids content is available online and what are kids really seeing on things like YouTube Kids. And I kind of wanted to talk very specifically about how we have kind of gotten to this point, right? So, and these are some lessons I'd like you to take from this and talk about. Because basically what we are seeing right now is the 3 phases of kids on the internet. And again, I like to be able to predict the future, you know, because it makes me sound sort of mystical and wise, but also because this is important stuff that you guys should know about. You know, again, if you are doing anything within the media spectrum whatsoever, you need to know this stuff. So let's look at phase 1. Phase 1 was, there are no children on the internet, children don't exist, right? I know people laugh at that right now, but 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 3 years ago, 2 years ago, you would see things like this. And again, I'm not beating up Google, although it's fun to do that, but I just sort of picked their age requirements screen, and you can see that these are the minimum age requirements to own a Google account. You have to be 13 or 14 or 16. And these were things like YouTube, which have huge amounts of kids that everyone knows, Gmail, anything that's a Google account. Right? And the whole approach was, look, we're just going to pretend that children don't exist, right? If you look at something like Apple, so one of our products is PopJam, which, by the way, is just launched in Vietnam and Australia. It's a social content app for kids. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But it's aimed predominantly at 7 to 11-year-olds. So in the App Store, it's got a 9+ rating. If you go, and up until a few weeks ago, if you searched for PopJam in the App Store with your adult account, you would be automatically served adult dating apps against this, right? Now, just going back to all my parents for 1 second, how many of you who have kids have allowed them to use your device at one point ever? Hands up, I won't judge. Right, that's pretty much most of you, right? So what's happening is that kids are using their parents' accounts and they are being served adult ads even when they're searching for kids' content, right? And again, this is clearly not Apple deliberately trying to do this. This is search algorithms that haven't been thought through by engineers. Now, in Apple's complete defense, they have changed their search algo on this. So full credit to them for realizing, but it's a classic case of, hey, children aren't here, we're not even gonna think about it, right? That was phase one. That's starting to end, which is good. Phase two of general children on the internet is, okay, we accept the fact that children exist, that these small people are actually real and they're not figments of our imagination. Let's try and do something about this. We're gonna reuse all the parental technology that we've built. I mean, already that sounds like a bad idea, but let's see how it plays out. Humor me. So phase one was, well, okay, people put content in the wrong places, right? So we go, okay, kids are in lots of adult platforms, like, for example, YouTube. So we're gonna put all of our kids' content there. Unfortunately, that doesn't really work. Because again, you're putting kids' content into an adult place. And kids have this really annoying habit of like just pressing the next button or looking at suggestions for other content you might like, which is one of the worst inventions in human history. And this week we had a New York Times article, which was actually about YouTube Kids. And again, we know the YouTube Kids team. I'm not beating them up. I'm just using it as an example. YouTube Kids is a kids version of YouTube, but it works by just filtering the main YouTube content. So it serves what it thinks is kids content into the kids app. The problem is that that filter isn't 100%. So sometimes it lets really bad things into YouTube Kids, which is specifically marketed to 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds. You don't want 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds looking at Paw Patrol babies pretend to die by suicide. It's not a good thing. And the challenge is, again, YouTube trying to do the right thing, in terms of addressing the fact that they have kids on their platform, but still ultimately coming back to sort of the classic phase two mistake, which is, well, we're just gonna try and reuse the tech that worked perfectly well for grown-ups, and we'll hope that we'll kind of maybe paper over the cracks and maybe kids won't see the really, really bad things that sometimes sneak through. This was a great headline that I saw pop up the other week. Actually, Eleanor wrote it. And we've been looking at, we actually have a big post coming on this shortly. We've been looking at the amount of data that is collected on kids by ad tech companies up to the age of 13. So we're looking at what sits in all the DMPs, and it is going to scare the shit out of you. Right, which is essentially, if you can imagine those of you who have parents and also those of you who don't, the equivalent of like two men in anoraks following your child around in school and sort of watching what they're doing and reading and looking at and who they're talking to, and then following them back home after school and watching what websites they're going to, writing all this information down. And then at night they go out and they have their secret conferences and they compare these notes with all of this data on a 7-year-old. I hope you're all feeling horrified, because that's kind of the shit that's happening right now. And this is what these kids are growing up into. So when I get a little bit annoyed when I see companies with all the resources of Google not investing properly in kids' technology when they could very, very easily do that. Which brings me to phase three, which is really what, as the industry, we should be doing and what we have spent tens of millions of dollars at this point in building, which is what we call kid tech, which is actually technology and services and processes designed for under 13s. And this is what in the West, we've built super awesome very specifically to do. And I'm gonna show you a few things that have been built. I'm really not trying to sell you on them, just to show you, because it's really about what the other brands are doing. So going back to PopJam, which is the biggest kids content platform that does social, it's now being used by the top kids brands, like Hasbro, like Nintendo, like Disney. So it's a dedicated under 13 place for kids to do social. So instead of kind of creating pages and areas in 13 plus social platforms, which just aren't appropriate for 7-year-olds and 8-year-olds and 9-year-olds and 10-year-olds, this is a dedicated place where they can go. It gives them tools where they can actually create their own pictures and images, all fully moderated, fully curated. And let me show you the proof in the pudding. This is the actual audience demographics on PopJam. You know, this is how it plays out, right? You know, you've got kids who they are still, up until the age of 6, they sort of self-identify as kids. Sorry, I'll get out of the way for your images. Once they get into 7, 8, and 9, and again, you'll recognize this if you have them, they start to become a little bit more adult, right? They know that they're not adults, but they don't want to be recognized as kids, right? They want to be seen as their own person. So what's happening is that as they are getting up into this 8, 9, 10 stage, you know, they want a safe environment, but they still want to play at being an adult. Once they get into 11 and 12, they get much more comfortable and confident in going into more of an adult environment. That's when they start to sort of adopt en masse things like Snapchat and Instagram and so forth. So with PopJam and with all of the kid tech stuff that's being built by us and some other companies, you know, this is the proof that you build the right thing for the right audience, and they come and they spend a lot of time with it. And you know, it's one of the things that Totally Awesome is doing here in APAC, you know, in terms of building our kids' digital media business specifically for the under 13 market, specifically building solution for advertisers and brands. There's other companies doing great work here as well, like Fingerprint, like Hopster. So there is a generation, a cohort of companies that are now building kid tech. So I think if any of you are sort of thinking about this or looking at the space, you need to go and actually hunt down these companies and work with them. Because not only, I mean, even just forgetting the moral argument for 1 second, right? It works, right? It is accessing kids. It is giving you the right kind of engagement that you need. So I'm going to finish on one final slide before we go to questions. And that is my call to arms for today, right? Because we, as an industry, as a media sector, as a geography, we need to establish the standard for kid tech, right? And there are 3 things that you should look for in all sorts of kid technology, right? We must make sure that it is built specifically for kids. We must not be reusing adult technology. Bad things lie there. It's got to be built for digital privacy. Remember, everything about kids and under 13 is privacy-based. Privacy, privacy, privacy. We can do this right. And thirdly, it's got to be built for what we call media sustainability, right? We are trying to enable more digital dollars to go into the kid space, not less. We want content owners to generate more digital revenue, not less. You know, we want to make sure that the next creators of Peppa Pig and Thomas the Tank Engine can afford to do so. So the last thing we are trying to do is actually prevent advertising. We are trying to enable more of it, but much more safely than ever before. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is what is going on in the kids market. This is what Centennials are doing. They are coming to kill you all, and they are going to do very, very interesting things. And if nothing else, I hope that you leave this room a little bit more interested in what your kids or nieces or nephews or sisters or brothers are actually doing than when you entered. Thank you very much for your attention.
I think we have time for a couple of questions. So does anybody have any questions for Dylan? So, can we get a mic to this gentleman at the front here, please? Do I just state your name and?
Oh, hi, Dylan. I'm Adam Hodge from Octagon. As a father of 2, thanks for scaring the shit out of me with the guys in anoraks. I appreciate that. Agree with everything that you've said. What's different about these products to things like Bebo, Habbo Hotel, Club Penguin that have tried to have curated, privacy-controlled social communities for kids in the past, and some of them still exist, but not much, and others don't exist at all?
I guess they're the modern version of them. I mean, when you were looking at things like Club Penguin and Habbo, a lot of the data privacy laws back then weren't as established as they are today. So there were far less tools and technology, there were far less moderation tools and technology that were available to keep kids safe. So essentially, you were sort of trying to rely on broadly trying to keep sort of the 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16-year-olds away from the 4, 5, 6, 7-year-olds in a lot of different ways. So they were, I mean, you know, Lane and the team in Club Penguin did a phenomenal job in there, as did the entire Disney team when they took it over. I think that is one of the great, excuse me, one of the great success stories, and is still definitely the benchmark in some respects for kids social. I think what's happening now is that, you know, I mean, that cohort of kids' digital properties was very desktop web-based, right? So it was, from a parental point of view, supervision is a much easier thing. I mean, even physically, right? You can sit down and sit over your child's shoulder, right? When a kid is accessing something on a device, they're running off into a room, you can't physically follow them around the whole time, which means you have to rely more, these properties and apps have to rely more and more on the technology behind the scenes that are doing more of the I suppose, the subtle parenting in terms of content, in terms of data privacy. So I'll give you an example with, you know, one of the things that I see a lot of apps fall into for kids is they allow kids to take selfies, to take photos of themselves. Now, you're not allowed to actually do that under COPPA in the US, and it'll be illegal in the EU in May next year as well. So with PopJam, it actually allows it, but it puts an automatic filter in place, which puts a big smiley on the kid's face. So you can never have an actual image of a child in the app whatsoever, right? So I'm just giving you an example that we use there. So I would say that the technology has definitely advanced a lot from the days of Club Penguin. As it happens, I'm literally seeing the founder on Monday for breakfast. So we talk about this sort of stuff a lot. But it's difficult because, you know, kids, I mean, again, back then, kids had access to a limited portfolio of games, right? Whereas on the App Store, there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands, many of which not flagged. So it's definitely become harder, I think, both for parents and for sort of developers of kids' content.
Okay, we've got two at the back, so do you want to just, that gentleman up there?
Hi, so what you showed was more about, like, for example, adults watch videos, so kids watch certain kinds of videos, or adults are on social, so kids have a social platform. But do you see any alternate forms of content for kids, which also gets part of kids' tech? Like maybe, you know, how do you link it with education or other verticals?
I think you're seeing the space evolve almost on a weekly basis. I mean, you got to bear in mind, and this was kind of why I put some data in there about sort of the history of the kids media space. You know, kids technology, kid tech or digital kids, its history has only been the last 5 or 6 or 7 years, right? Whereas the history of kids TV goes back decades. And if you look at sort of the mainstream, like our adult digital media, social media world, even there, the history now goes back some decades as well. So in a lot of ways, we are still building in a very, very early phase of the entire digital kids ecosystem, whether it's entertainment or whether it's education. I mean, I think there are more and more startups that I'm seeing that are trying to focus on educational content within the classrooms, that are trying to figure out how to bridge what is still very much a desktop-based classroom environment for many, many schools, to figuring out how to sort of deal with the new reality of kids, where they're spending a little bit of time learning in the classroom, but they're doing more and more learning at home. So there's companies like, for example, Epic, who are based in California, which they have it's a kid's book subscription business. And they make it freely available for schools, but then they have a subscription for use at home. But it's you know, you also have the challenge that for venture capitalists, for investors, you know, they have no history, they have no experience in what works and what doesn't work in the space. So even the financing for these startups, you know, is still relatively hard to come by. So it's a new and emerging sector, I would say, both on the education side and on the entertainment side. But that's why the opportunity is so huge, you know, because at the end of the day, unless my biology is incorrect, there are only going to be more children, and there is probably only going to be more internet. You know, so this is going to become a bigger and bigger and bigger part of the fabric of our society. So I think in the same way that you are starting to see the emergence now of the first proper kid-safe platforms, you know, the digital media companies like like Totally Awesome, like Fingerprint, the tech companies like Super Awesome, you'll see the same pattern, and I'm sure you are still seeing the same pattern in the educational sector. I know the entertainment space better, so it's hard for me to speak to more specific examples than that.
I think there was a lady at the back who had a question, yeah.
Hello. I'd like to ask what you think of the Asian market and what kind of forward trends you personally think or have identified for parenting choices and, you know, kids' consumption choices, because traditionally, especially in the Southeast Asian market, I think the parents here, the moms here specifically, are a bit less tech savvy and have a shorter time span being exposed to digital media. So what do you see as forward consumption trends for the parents, for their kids, and the kids themselves in Asia? Thank you.
I think that the APAC market, I mean, with Totally Awesome, we operate throughout Southeast Asia and into Australia as well. So we've got pretty good data on this. I mean, I would say the broad trends are very similar to what we see in the US, right? In terms of kids spending much more time on tablets. In many cases, the acceleration away from TV is slightly quicker. I think the huge challenge is, as it is more or less everywhere, is the gap in understanding between the parents and the children. Of what is actually available on app stores and what the technology is there. I think that content, you know, the well-known IPs remain very, very popular in Southeast Asia. You know, I think if you look at on a country-by-country basis, you know, one of the interesting things about APAC is that some of the most popular digital kids content is still a lot of Western IP that's being consumed. One of the things that I'm waiting to see more of is much more local digital kids content being produced on a country-by-country basis that is going to get bigger and bigger here, rather than you know, kids playing a version of whatever big Western game it happens to be, like Roblox or something like that. So I think that's something you're probably going to see in the next 3 or 4 or 5 years. There's always been much more of an emphasis on education in Southeast Asia, you know, really across the board. And I would say that that is still probably the case than what we see in the US. So I think that parents are probably much more involved here in using those same devices as an educational acceleration mechanic, particularly across Southeast Asia, much more so than you would see in the US. I mean, I think a tablet is still seen primarily as a babysitter and as an entertainment device in the US by parents for their kids, rather than an educational tool where it's kind of 50-50 here. I think there is also there are more, and again, this depends specifically on the country, there are more shared devices across Southeast Asia than you would see in other places. Again, this will change over time as well. But I think the big trend will be, as we are seeing pretty much everywhere, is the emergence of kids-specific agencies and platforms for local markets. Because, you know, as you know, the population pyramid is quite different for most of Southeast Asia. There are a much greater percentage of kids in any local population than there will be in the West. So for everything I'm talking about here, which, as you can tell by my accent, comes from a very Western point of view, it is going to be even more accelerated and even more pronounced here over the next few years. And you know, there are very, very few indigenous digital companies here in the kid space. There need to be more of them.
I'm afraid we've run out of time.
Oh, there's one more. We can do one more question.
Go on, as long as it's a quick one.
Thank you. Hold on, you've got a mic. You've got a mic.
You mentioned about the child being the household CTO. One thing that I find a bit strange is that aren't we adults trying to restrict children on using certain apps? Because my son will not be restricted to an app. I mean, he's 12 and he's discovered more things on the internet than I have in the last 20 years. So I'm a bit, whose responsibility is it? Is it the school, the child, the parent, the platform? Because you keep on, you know, giving Google a hard time. So Whose responsibility is it? And
Well,
who's going to take the reins?
Right. So I love the way you asked the simplest, shortest question at the very, very end, right? Which is basically who sort of controls the world. It is. Let me answer briefly in like the 20 seconds I have. I think first of all, like the platform holders who know they have kids on their platforms have a responsibility to deal with kids properly. You know, there is no excuse for companies that have market caps of tens or hundreds of billions of dollars to not invest more in their kids, in their kids' digital engagement, whatever it is. One, right? Two, there is more and more investment that's going on into these kid tech and privacy tech startups, which is starting to bubble up and help. Three, parents have much more of a responsibility than they ever did. I think it's probably harder being a parent now than it maybe was 10 years ago, right? I really do. I think it's tough. I think teachers are probably in the toughest spot, right? Because they don't know what's going on at home. They're probably under-resourced, and you can be sure the kids aren't telling them the whole truth anyway. You know, so I think you probably have to sort of discount what you think is being done in school and probably over-index what's being done at home in terms of digital education. That being said, I think that kids are growing up now, this Centennial group, have a better awareness of things that they shouldn't do online than maybe sort of kids who are even sort of 5 years older. Like they realize that sharing their information online is probably not a good idea, and they shouldn't just click or tap on everything. But the TLDR on that is, yes, I'm sorry, it's hard. Being a parent is tricky. Sorry.
All right, on that note, I'm afraid we do have to start wrapping up. But before we thank Dylan, I've just got a couple of housekeeping announcements. So we're back here at noon for the next session, which is entitled Unlock the Ingenuity of Your People, the 4 practices of performance multiplying marketing leaders. And in case you haven't already, please do download the Mumbrella Asia app from the App Store or Google, and that will give you an insight into all the sessions today. So please do join me in thanking Dylan for a great session.
Thank you, guys.